This is Group Two's presentation of the Alltel LBO. My name is Justin Golightly.
I'm Trent Park.
I'm Natasha Simpson.
And I'm Austin Tatum.
Allied Telephone Company, now known as Alltel, opened in 1943 as a business specializing in telephones and telephone cabling, serving the state of Arkansas. Alltel steadily grew over the years, but it wasn't until 1996, when President Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act, that the company really started to grow as a strong competitor. This act allowed for future deregulation of the industry. At the time of the signing, Clinton said of the act, "It promotes competition as the key to opening new markets and new opportunities. It will protect consumers by regulating the remaining monopolies for a time and by providing a roadmap for deregulation in the future." By mid-2007, Alltel had grown to be the fifth largest wireless service provider by subscriber and had the largest coverage footprint in the United States by area. At the time of acquisition, the company served 34 states across the U.S. with almost 13 million subscribers. Interest for the company was piqued in late 2006 when it was announced via conference call that leadership was reviewing its strategic options. Private equity firms started announcing their interest in the company shortly thereafter. Ultimately, GS Capital Partners, the private equity arm of Goldman Sachs, and TPG Capital won the right to purchase Alltel for $27.5 billion, making it the largest ever private equity investment in the U.S. Then President and CEO Scott Ford said of taking the company private, "This transaction delivers substantial value to our shareholders, and we want to thank them again for their support through the years." Shortly thereafter, Verizon Wireless stepped in and purchased Alltel for $28.1 billion. Rumors originally surfaced in 2005 that Verizon was interested in the company before GS and TPG ultimately made their winning bid. The swift resale of Alltel was one of the quickest flips in corporate history.
TPG and Goldman Sachs Capital Partners weren't the only ones interested in acquiring Alltel. The duo definitely had some competition. Mostly they had competition with industry rivals. These were primarily the aforementioned Verizon Wireless, which ended up taking over Alltel in 2008, and AT&T. Both Verizon Wireless and AT&T each had over 60 million wireless subscribers at the time, compared to Alltel's 12 million customers. Next followed Vodafone Group plc, a British multinational telecommunications company, and the well-known Sprint Nextel Corp. Apart from industry-relevant rivals, TPG and Goldman Sachs Capital Partners also had to beat out other private equity teams vying for ownership of Alltel. Two such groups were rumored to be in the running. First, Providence Equity Partners had teamed up with the Blackstone Group for a pass at Alltel. The Carlyle Group and Kohlberg Kravis Robertson Company had also allegedly pooled resources for a chance at the prize. Typically, a firm that is looking to be bought out will initiate an auction by soliciting bids from numerous strategic and financial parties. First-round bids for Alltel weren't due until June 6, 2007. However, Alltel accepted a takeover offer from TPG and Goldman Sachs without completing an auction that had attracted the other bidders, and without knowing if that auction would draw even higher bids. Alltel was purchased for a grand total of $27.5 billion. TPG and Goldman Sachs Capital Partners each issued new equity to come up with a combined amount of $4.6 billion. The rest of the buyout was leveraged. Four other financial institutions lent an additional $15.5 billion for the takeover. This debt was issued by Citibank, Goldman Sachs Credit Partners, Citigroup Global Markets, Barclays Bank, and the Royal Bank of Scotland. The remaining $7.4 billion was received by way of a bridge loan. In the loan agreement, these four institutions also guaranteed up to an additional $750 million in delayed draw term loan facility to be used to acquire any other licenses or rights.
TPG and Goldman Sachs agreed to pay a whopping $27.5 billion to take Alltel private. This huge deal became the largest telecommunications buyout of its time. The $27.5 billion amounts to $71.50 per share, a 9.6% premium over their shares on May 18th, before they were bought out. The $71.50 also came in at a greater 23% premium over the share price when the talks first became public. Listed here are a few of the key pricing multiples that produce the Alltel valuation, as well as other comparable telecom buyouts. You can see that Alltel's EBITDA multiple, which is the most commonly referenced metric for valuation, falls in line with other telecom buyouts. However, their revenue multiple was more than double the other buyouts, suggesting that Alltel had better margins. This could be due in part to the great management team that ran the company.
This transaction was not without its regulatory requirements and other issues. Stockholders had to approve of the offer, even though the offer came before the official bid period had concluded, which risked giving up some value of a potential better offer. A pre-merger notification was required by the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act, which allowed the government to track the acquisition. Additionally, as this was the biggest communications deal in history at the time, FCC approval was required. The Department of Justice approval was required to ensure that no trust was being formed. One issue that caused some reservations with shareholders was the hefty $625 million termination fee. Other various forms and investment banking fees were required to complete the transaction, along with an audit by PricewaterhouseCoopers, which found Alltel's accounting met GAAP standards. Lastly, because of the extreme increase in leverage, credit ratings of Alltel were immediately downgraded. The total purchase price of $27.5 billion included $4.6 billion of equity contributed by TPG and Goldman Sachs. The equity accounts for 16% of the total purchase price. Senior secured financing accounted for 56% of the total purchase price, for a total value of $15.5 billion, which may be increased by up to $750 million. Citibank was the bank as administrative agent. Goldman Sachs, Citigroup Global Markets, Barclays Bank, and the Royal Bank of Scotland were all joint bookrunners. Goldman Sachs was a syndication agent, and the Royal Bank of Scotland and Barclays were the co-documentation agents. Multiple banks were involved in this transaction to diversify risk away from their bank and allow for the large leverage amount that this transaction required. $14 billion of the $15.5 billion was a term loan maturing on May 15, 2015, which consisted of 3 tranches. The last portion of the $15.5 billion was a $1.5 billion revolving credit maturing on November 15, 2013. And lastly, there was a $750 million additional delayed draw loan for amounts that may have been required to acquire FCC licenses for this type of transaction. The remaining 28%, for a grand total of 84% debt of the transaction, comes from a senior unsecured interim loan of $7.7 billion, often referred to as a bridge loan, with Citibank as the administrative agent. $5.2 billion of the $7.7 billion is a senior unsecured cash pay interim loan facility with an initial term of 1 year. There was also a $2.5 billion senior unsecured PIK toggle interim loan facility. Reasons for using this expensive form of debt was it would allow the company to defer their interest payments on the PIK loan, which stands for a payment in kind loan. They were allowed to defer all interest payments to the end of the 1 year term, freeing up cash flows initially and reducing risk of a cash crunch. This is commonly used before 2008, but isn't around very much anymore as it is an expensive form of debt. The end result of this transaction can be seen fairly easily with some of the ratios. Initially, TPG and Goldman Sachs purchased Alltel for $27.5 billion, which is 8.9 times the 2008 earnings estimates. The pre-acquisition debt-to-earnings ratio was 1.1, which rose to 6.5 after the acquisition in 2008. In 2008, when TPG and Goldman sold Alltel to Verizon for $28.1 billion, that was for 8.1 times the actual 2008 earnings. The result of this full transaction was a $0.6 billion gain on a $4.6 billion equity investment, which is approximately a 13% gain for Goldman and TPG.